the director of the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies here at Johns Hopkins University SAIS. And we'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today on East Asia in the post-COVID-19 world, China and beyond. We certainly will cover issues relating to China, but one of our major points is that one has to look broadly at the East Asian region as a whole and its dynamic changing characteristics. As our commentator today, we're privileged to have another member of the SAIS Johns Hopkins faculty, Professor David Shear. I also, of course, am a faculty member at Johns Hopkins. Ambassador Shear served as ambassador to Vietnam. He was head of the China Office of China Affairs in the State Department, and also as Assistant Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the United States. So we are delighted to have everyone here. Let me start also by introducing a group of our Reischauer Policy Research Fellows who also will be giving commentary today and have helped in the preparation of this task force report. First of all, from the Neve Denny, who is the coordinator of the Reischauer Center. Secondly, Vivian Chen, who is also a Reischauer Policy Research Fellow. Sam Frost, Reischauer Policy Research Fellow. And Ayane Nakano, also with the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. We also have other participants. Monica Weller is a Reischauer Policy Research Fellow. And then finally, Evan Sankey, also a Reischauer Policy Research Fellow. And later you will hear from all of these people, and in particular at some length from Ambassador Shear in terms of his commentary. Let me first, however, go briefly to the details. If the others, people could leave the stage now, and we'll go to the details of the report itself. We all believe that, and we all know that, of course, there are important pre-existing trends in East Asia that preceded COVID-19. Our focus here is the impact of COVID-19, but deepening US-China tensions, the situation in Hong Kong, fluidity and conflict patterns on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, President Trump met down in Singapore last June with Kim Jong-un, and since then there's a series of developments in Korea. So there are a range of things, and Ambassador Shear will be going into those in greater detail that of course preceded, but then COVID itself has intensified pre-existing trends in some important ways. Our report makes several simple but important points. First of all, we believe that East Asia's generally successful response to COVID-19 is accelerating its geopolitical rise. Obviously, there are variations by country. The countries we'll be looking at particularly are China, South Korea, Taiwan, of course, is a part of China, but Taiwan's unique situation, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. So China certainly is one pattern. It's by no means the only beneficiary. The Asian tigers are also benefiting, and in certain respects, more so going forward. The impact of COVID-19 on China is mixed. Um, East Asia, and we also will get into issues relating to medical supply. For example, the question of um, the reshoring tendencies in the United States, Congress, and its recent uh, activities. And so there are some important medical supply issues that we will consider. Regarding the specific countries, let me just summarize, and then we'll go into more detail. China, of course, was the first out of the pandemic. Of course, particularly in Wuhan, of course, there was a very severe lockdown, deeply felt sacrifices, economic effects were severe at first. The first quarter GDP fell sharply, but those economic effects are receding. There's a stimulus package that we'll discuss. Digitalization was accelerated in many ways. On the political side, of course, a sense of domestic unity and common purpose flowing from the sacrifice. But then China also has capitalized on its early exit from the crisis to extend its influence in various ways, and we'll discuss that. Ambassador Shear will consider that in some detail. In the case of Korea, it was also very quick out of the pandemic, as China was, which has led to some deeper economic relationships. This early exit also helped with government legitimacy. As we'll see, the Moon administration benefited politically, and the National Assembly elections went very smoothly for them. There's an important issue that we will consider of North Korea, of North-South relations, how and in what ways it finds the Seoul's overtures attractive, what possibilities might exist for revived North-South dialogue. In Taiwan, Taiwan was, as we'll see, relatively effective in its COVID response, leading to domestic, more logistic legitimacy and a changing international role. In the case of Singapore also, which we consider in our report, problems with guest workers, but relatively successful in containing COVID-19 and playing an important role in medical supply. The big question that we will address toward the end is Japan. Enormous potential, of course, as the largest creditor in the world, the number 3 economy in the world, sophisticated technology, a seemingly positive COVID-19 record in terms of declared infections and morbidity. Ambiguities remain. Has Japan been successful? How successful? How do we know? What will its future role be, given the scale of the economy and the changing political economy of the region? So many questions. We're fortunate, as I mentioned before, to have researchers who have also been working, who specialize on East Asian political economy and who've been working intensively on this question, on the various questions here. We thought to make this webinar as concise as possible. They would speak very briefly to highly focused questions. China, some important questions regarding China are the first things. And one question is the nature of Chinese stimulus. The United States, of course, has a $2 trillion stimulus package and more. Congress has been talking about more. How does China relate to that? What's the scale of the stimulus and how is it constructed? To speak to that issue, Evan Sankey has background relating to that. Evan, can you hear us here? Yes, Evan.
Hello.
Please.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, the China's coronavirus era stimulus package is approximately the same size in absolute terms as its stimulus package after the global financial crisis of 2008. So it's just over 550 billion US dollars. But since China's economy is, of course, much larger today than it was in 2008, that's a smaller share of GDP. So today's Chinese stimulus package is about 4% of GDP. In 2008, it was about 13% of GDP. The package seems weighted towards tax cuts, automatic stabilizers. They've been sending out consumption vouchers, essentially, that have sunset provisions. So if you don't spend them, you lose them in an effort to prevent people from saving stimulus transfers. It also seems like there are infrastructure provisions of the new stimulus package. They're a smaller share of the stimulus package. And it seems like they're also geared towards different types of infrastructure. So China's 2008 stimulus was famously heavy on hard debt financed infrastructure like high-speed rail and airports and
Evan,
bridges.
how large is the Chinese stimulus as a share of GDP relative to other major nations?
It's quite small, at 4% of GDP for China versus, depending on how you measure it, 12% for the US, 21% for Japan, 13% for South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
It's unclear exactly why that is. There's been some speculation that China is keeping its powder dry in order to respond to more shocks in the future.
Thank you. So, in other words, the stimulus itself is not relative to the economy as massive as the last time around. It will contribute something to Chinese growth, but it's not really what is pulling, not the only factor pulling China out of this situation. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Now, as of course, the question remains of what it is that is driving China's emergence from the current situation. We have another intriguing issue, the role of digitalization, both in containing the pandemic in China and also in stimulating economic recovery. Of course, at the same time, it also has the effect of reinforcing government control capabilities. Vivian Chen has been looking at the issue of digitalization and its implications. Vivian?
That's correct. China has been employing a lot of its high-level technologies, especially its strong 5G network, to fight the pandemic. It has used a network specifically for powering drones to employ in a variety of settings, including consumer deliveries such as food and supplies, as well as delivering COVID-19 medical samples for testing, along with spraying disinfectant in areas and cities. In addition, China has also created, through collaborating tech giants Alipay and WeChat, a health code app so that every Chinese citizen will be separated into 3 categories: red, yellow, and green. In that, depending on their status, that will limit their movements and prevent them from entering public venues such as malls, offices, and subway stations.
Do I understand China also has been using digitalization to build hospitals rapidly and that sort of thing?
Yes, that's correct. They have used a digital tool called Building Information Modeling, which enabled hundreds of BIM designers across the nation to collaborate to build 2 Wuhan hospitals with 2,600 beds within 24 hours, and the construction drawings done within 60 hours.
I see. And so digitalization is a key element of their response. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If I might add another set of, on the downside, you've seen two positives that certainly are aiding China in responding. On the downside, thank you, Vivian. We have the BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative, as certain parts of the world, particularly Africa, possibly South Asia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, go into debt problems because as the world economy decelerates, there's an additional debt problems are arising. BRI is being complicated. There are, of course, quality issues in some parts of the world regarding medical equipment, but certainly China has reached out. It is supplying medical equipment to many new parts of the world, particularly in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. There's been positive responses to that. So there are both pluses and minuses for the BRI in the implications of the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you very much, Vivian. Now, next, the question I mentioned, the Asian tigers, not simply China, but Korea and Singapore and so on. And particularly in the case of Korea, it responded quite rapidly with implications that certainly appear to be positive for relationships across the Pacific with the United States. Monica Weller has been working on the effective Korean responses, which also, as we have heard, have positive implications politically for the current government there. Monica, how could you tell us a little about how Korea has responded and why what it has been doing to address the COVID-19 situation and what implications this has for its international relations?
Okay, so Korea has had previous experience with MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, where there was a mixed government response. And so when they started hearing about cases of COVID-19, they responded very rapidly. They began developing test kits January 16th, 4 days before the first case of infection had appeared in Korea. And after they expedited testing by selecting 5 qualified pharmaceutical organizations to bypass long certification laws. And so they relied a lot on artificial intelligence-based big data systems, so they were able to effectively test. And then they also were able to essentially produce tests that would give proven results within 6 hours by January 30th.
And this all redounded politically in a positive way to the Moon administration, didn't it? They were able to cut infections and so on rapidly. What were the political implications of this?
Correct. The results for the Democratic Party, which President Moon is in, were mixed, but because of the positive pandemic response, there was an overwhelming landslide victory, and so his party, along with the Platform Party, won 180 of the 300 seats, and it essentially gave them an absolute majority and a 3/5 supermajority that will allow them to fast track procedures in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as we'll discuss later, that could have implications for North-South relations too. Thank you, Monica. Thanks very much. And next, we'd like to look briefly at Taiwan. Sam Frost has been looking at Taiwan's response. They've used websites, testing, mass production, and so on. Could you give us just a few words more about what Taiwan has been doing, Sam?
Yes, so Taiwan's success in combating the spread of the virus has been nothing short of remarkable. It's to date, it has 443 confirmed cases and only 7 deaths. And this success has won Taiwan not only global recognition, but it's also obviated the need for a nationwide economic shutdown that so many other countries have had to do. And the general consensus on this success has been, it basically boils down to the speed of the response, speed of Taiwan's response made possible by a high level of preparedness and pre-existing institutions set up in the aftermath of SARS. Strictly enforced quarantines, thorough screening, and quarantines enforced by phone tracking and strict government diligence, and widespread and essentially universal masking made possible by a huge escalation in mask production. Taiwan put in 92 new production lines in 40 days of mask production and went from 1.8 million, producing 1.8 million masks a day to upwards of 19 million as it currently stands. And so this nationwide mobilization and success in combating the virus has been remarkable.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. Of course, as we can imagine, this has implications for medical supply. And in the interest of time, let me simply say we can come back to this in the Q&A because this is certainly a point that most of our participants know well. In the last few years, there's been very, very heavy reliance in the United States as well on China for basic pharmaceutical materials, for masks, for ventilators, PPE, and so on. The other Asian nations and territories, as we have just heard, also are beginning to develop capabilities quite strongly. Japan, as we'll hear later, certainly has potential. Now, and Sam, this would also relates to you as this the COVID-19 situation evolves. There is, of course, a movement toward reshoring in the United States. And on Capitol Hill, as the number of fatalities and so on in the US rises, there's movement to address the situation of medical supply and to develop stronger domestic alternatives. Sam, could you mention just a couple of the pieces of legislation that have begun to emerge in the United States in response to both the COVID situation and the heavy reliance on China particularly?
Yeah, so the concern about exposure to China for pharmaceuticals and a number of other medical supplies is pretty much bipartisan on Capitol Hill. And though there has been a significant amount of legislation introduced on this, there hasn't really been anything that has been enacted yet, but there's been a lot of activity in terms of bills that have been introduced. And probably the best example and the most prominent example was introduced in March by Marco Rubio, which is a bill called the Strengthening America's Supply Chains and National Security Act, which seeks to reduce America's supply chain risk and dependence on China for pharmaceuticals, primarily by directing the Department of Defense to determine the extent of its exposure to China for active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, and then determine whether this is a national security risk, and then what action should be taken to deal with it. And introduced by Rubio, but also enjoyed significant response from the other side of the aisle as well. Tim Kaine, Elizabeth Warren, and a number of prominent Democrats came out in support of it. And so this was probably the best example of the legislation that's been being introduced and passed around on Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We will come back to those issues. Thank you very much, Sam. Now, in the context of all of this, you'll remember that we really haven't touched much on Japan. But in beginning to think about Japan, I think we need to remember the basic situation that Japan has had as far as infections, morbidity, and so on. It started, in a way, it got exposed early. There were a lot of visitors from China. Many people say that it was slow in response, perhaps worried about what would happen to the Olympics. There was the Diamond Princess. There were some major cases early on. But Ayane Nakano, I know you've been following this issue closely. How has Japan been doing very recently? What is the situation in terms of infections and so on in Japan right now?
Yes, so Japan, so thank you for asking. So Japan has just lifted the state of emergency because infections have gone down very sharply. Even though there are currently 2 outbreaks in Japan, indicating the possibility of a second wave. However, the risk of overwhelming the medical system or lack of effective treatment seems unlikely due to Japan's current high recovery rate.
Mm-hmm.
So research suggests that factors like wearing masks daily, Japan's current low hospitalization rates, and treatments like Ibogan, may be keeping this number low in Japan for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We'll come back to these issues, but that raises an issue of how Japan's potential might be used in the future. Of course, there's confirmation that we need in terms of Japanese practices and the actual degree of community spread and so on. But on that particular point, and especially the question of U.S.-Japan cooperation, Neve Denny, you've been working on that question. Do you want to say just a word or two about that?
Yes, as our report suggests, the U.S. has been learning a lot from Asia, but also the U.S. has been working with its partners and allies to help mitigate the effects of COVID-19. And 2020 marks the 60th anniversary of the signing of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. But since 1951, the U.S. and Japan have been cooperating with regard to medical response. So the U.S. and Japan have started a cooperative medical sciences program as early as 1966. And the U.S. and Japan Partnership for Global Health was started by President Bush and Prime Minister Koizumi in 2002 to cooperate not just on the response, but also on medical aid and how it is distributed. So there's a lot of room for growth, and there are a lot of different institutions in place for the US and Japan to continue to be global leaders in this response.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Neve. You've raised some extremely interesting issues for the future, especially in the context of Capitol Hill's interest in medical supply. One wonders whether there could be ways that Japan might cooperate as an ally, or possibly Korea or some of the other nations in the Pacific. Thanks very much. on exactly one of the major elements of our report, I should emphasize, and Neve has begun to touch on that, is the relationship between health security in the midst of this pandemic and national security. And so where are we going? Where is the United States going? Where is the world going in terms of thinking about health issues in the midst of a pandemic with over 100,000 fatalities already in the United States and the number rising? In terms of thinking of healthcare and pandemics as a national security question, that's a big question that we have in our report, and that we hope will begin to spur a broader debate. In the Q&A, I'm sure we'll have more opportunity to discuss that. But in the interest of time, and also because of his expertise, we look forward to hearing from Ambassador David Shear. Dave, do you have any thoughts on the report, or more generally on what the East Asia in the post-COVID world is going to look like?
Thank you very much, Kent. I'd like to frame these great presentations by talking about the regional security situation, particularly the US-China relationship, which of course is the relationship which probably has the greatest effect on overall regional stability. And the US-China relationship hasn't been worse since the Cultural Revolution, I'd say. I've been watching China since I entered SAIS in 1980 as a graduate student, and it hasn't been this bad. I'd say the post-Tiananmen massacre was pretty bad, and it included sanctions, but even in those days, there was a modicum of trust, there was growing communication, and there was a great deal of restraint on both sides. Those are three things that I think are increasingly lacking in current US-China relations. And I'd like to outline some of the factors behind the current nosedive in the bilateral US-China relationship. One factor, of course, is intense blame shifting. Since February, at least, both the US and China have attempted to shift blame on the other for the effects of the COVID virus, with the Chinese suggesting that the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman suggesting that the US Army may have introduced somehow the virus to China, with the Chinese openly calling Secretary of State Pompeo a liar, and with President Trump suggesting that the virus may have originated in the Wuhan Epidemiological Institute. So there's a great deal of blame shifting. This has certainly undermined trust between the two sides. Secondly, there is a lack of direct communication at the senior levels. Communication between Secretary of State Pompeo and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been sporadic at best. I suspect the contents of their conversations have been somewhat acrimonious. The president last spoke with President Trump at the end of March. So communication right now is at an all-time ebb, I think, at the senior-most levels. Third, there are increasing tensions, of course, related to Hong Kong, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea. Chinese action in the National People's Congress passage of the security law relating to Hong Kong basically undermined Hong Kong's autonomy, severely undermined Hong Kong's autonomy. Military operations in both the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea are increasing, with both sides trading accusations in those areas. There remains a potential for increased trade friction, despite the conclusion in January of our Phase 1 trade agreement. Congress is taking action vis-a-vis China, most recently by passing what is known as the Taipei Act, which encourages the US executive arm to support Taiwan's maintenance of normal diplomatic relations with the 15 remaining countries that continue to recognize Taiwan. Congress recently passed the Uyghur Human Rights Act, and Senator Kppen has introduced a bill proposing to strip China of sovereign immunity relating to COVID cases in the United States. So there's some serious legislation coming down the pipeline on the Hill, with probably more in train after that. Another factor is Chinese, what they call wolf warrior diplomacy. Wolf Warrior was a 2015 action film featuring a Chinese special forces team fighting a variety of enemies, including Americans, that became very popular. Wolf warrior diplomacy relates to the sometimes very shrill way in which the Chinese are reacting to criticism of their handling of the COVID virus, particularly with regard to Australia. The Chinese ambassador very vituperatively threatened the Chinese with, or threatened the Australians with economic sanctions in response to an Australian proposal that the world conduct an independent inquiry into the origin of the COVID virus. The Chinese subsequently actually sanctioned Australian beef imports into China. Finally, is the US presidential election. China has never figured as prominently as it has now in US presidential elections. Both parties are trying to demonstrate how tough they can be on China, and the rhetoric with regard to China in the presidential election is probably going to get more strident before it gets more restrained. Moderating all these factors is the fact that everybody in the region apparently is interested in just getting through the American presidential election without incident. I don't expect there will be conscious efforts on either the US or Chinese side to fan the flames beyond rhetoric. Although it's clear that the Chinese are taking advantage of our preoccupations with US domestic politics to strengthen their hand in Hong Kong. So, the situation is dicey. As I said, the three main elements in maintaining stability in US-China relationship are trust, communication, and restraint, and we're seeing very little of any of those right now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. We have a fascinating set of issues before us here. One question, we raise it in the report, and maybe, well, you would be very well placed to deal with this, is the question in various dimensions of North-South relations in Korea. And also the relationship to the implications of the COVID-19 for broader cooperation within the so-called Quad, the relationships among the US, Japan, India, Australia, Indo-Pacific, the relationship of COVID-19 to Indo-Pacific. Is this going to strengthen those ties, weaken them? How do we think about those two problems, the Korean Peninsula and then the implications for Indo-Pacific?
First, in response to your question on the Quad, the US has been cooperating bilaterally on COVID with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan fairly closely. For example, with a recent telephone call between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, the two sides agreed to increase cooperation in developing vaccines. Both Korea and Taiwan have provided the US with a lot of PPE, for example, as well as with testing kits. But there are opportunities, broader opportunities for multilateral cooperation in the region, short of working with the UN. And one of those opportunities involves the Quad, which includes Japan, Australia, India, and the US, plus 3 other countries, New Zealand, the ROK, and Vietnam. Deputy Secretary of State Began had a phone call in March with the Quad +3 group to discuss COVID. I think we've had interactions at that level since with that group, and this looks like a very promising opportunity for multilateral cooperation on COVID and other issues among like-minded countries in the region. And of course, anything that the Quad +3 does will also strengthen, I think, trilateral US, Japan, ROK relations as well. And that's also a very important stabilizing factor in the Northeast Asian security equation.
Mm-hmm. Well, with certainly Korea, we'll have a chance to deal with Korea later on. But let me also ask a question that we have seen. We're not formally into Q&A, but you're the perfect person to ask about this, is how Taiwan's response, as we've said earlier, they've been very effective in their response to COVID-19 so far. And they weren't members of the WHO, World Health Organization. But how is their response, effective response, and really their mass diplomacy as well, influence their general standing and the evolution of US policy on the WHO?
Right, that's an important question. Well, of course, Taiwan's reaction to COVID has certainly increased its own prestige and reputation for good, high-level healthcare and high level of international cooperation in healthcare. And all of this has contributed to a stronger interest internationally in Taiwan's participation in the WHO. This became an important agenda item in the recent World Health Assembly virtual meeting, which was held 2 or 3 weeks ago, I believe, in which the United States and 14 other countries pressed for a closer relationship between the WHO and Taiwan. That effort failed in the formal WHO meeting. Taiwan's bilateral relationship with the WHO has been very, very difficult since the COVID crisis took place, with the WHO actually including Taiwan in its sections on reports on China, including Chinese data on COVID in Taiwan, with which the Taiwan officials have objected. The WHO Director General even accused people in Taiwan of making racial slurs on him. So while the COVID crisis and Taiwan's response has improved Taiwan's prestige overall, it's probably led to a deterioration in Taiwan's relationship with the WHO. And of course, all of the issues surrounding COVID and US-China relations have fed into a increasingly tense cross-strait relationship between the mainland and Taiwan as well. So Taiwan's great response to the COVID crisis has had both positive and negative effects on its international standing.
Yes, thank you very much. We've had just one other question, one question which has come in that I might say a word or two about, and then Dave, I'm sure you would have some thoughts. And the floor after that, the floor is certainly open. So those who would like to ask some questions, please do send them in. But the question related to this important uncertainty of North Korea. And as always, there's so much about North Korea that's not well known. But the question really had to do with COVID-19 and the north-south equation. In our report, we raised this as a question, and there's much still that remains to be known, but whether the combination of a strong electoral victory for Moon in the National Assembly elections, as Monica Weller pointed out, and then the situation in the North itself regarding COVID-19, which is not transparent, whether that interaction creates some new possibilities of diplomacy. What I could say to start is the North certainly has been trying very hard to insulate itself from the danger of COVID-19 that it clearly must have sensed because of the outbreak in Wuhan and across China that we've just been talking about. It closed its border very early. It banned foreign tourists, including Chinese tourists, on January 23rd, one of the earliest countries to do that. Its society, of course, is quite segmented. Transportation and movement controls are strong. But on the other hand, its healthcare system is very, very weak. Interestingly, and perhaps ominously, on June 1st, it opened schools once again. And the question was, isn't that potentially dangerous? I guess my personal non-professional assessment would be that it could well be in the absence of testing or other ways of affirming. And there's only a small number of test kits available. The numbers that we've heard in terms of test kits pledged is less than 20,000. So potentially that should be quite dangerous. And the North could very well be in the need of PPE and assistance of various kinds that could provide leverage, both reduce the likelihood of a sudden military action and also increase the possibility of negotiation. Dave, of course, you've been in senior positions with the Defense Department as well as in diplomacy. How do you see the implications of COVID for the North-South relations?
Well, North-South relations, like North Korea-US relations, have been pretty much stalled since the end of last year. The North has not been particularly aggressive in terms of the level of its provocations. It's only conducted 2 or 3 tests of short-range missiles, which I know are important to Japan and South Korea, but appear to be of less importance to President Trump. So things remain so far fairly frozen, with the biggest attention to North Korea recently being Kim Jong-un's apparent disappearance in the latter half of the latter 2 weeks of April. He showed a lot of journalists mistaken in their assessment of his health by showing up in the beginning of May. And he's shown up, I believe, since then as well. So relations are stalled. I expect that President Moon's increase in status as a result of his management of the COVID crisis, as well as a result of his party's victory in the National Assembly election, will incentivize him to make another North Korea play in the near to medium term. But he's going to have to pay close attention to the sanctions regime and close attention to the need to coordinate with the United States, which will be difficult both because of the US preoccupation with its domestic politics and its presidential election, as well as because of the current deadlock in host nation support talks between the US and the ROK.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, thank you. Certainly, you mentioned the sanctions regime, and of course, issues like that are also going to be extremely of concern. Surrounding countries like Japan will also be carefully watching this situation, even as perhaps it makes dealing between North and South Korea perhaps a little more fluid. We have some other questions actually for you, which have come in. The first of these, you noted that the Quad+3 efforts could possibly strengthen US-Japan ROK cooperation, which is, of course, interesting to a lot of people in the region. Have you seen any evidence of this? Because after all, the dynamic has been so troubled over the years that any positive sign, as this interlocutor says, would be welcome. So what do you think about that, about trilateral cooperation?
My sense is that the current Japan-ROK relationship is at sort of a recovery, a level that has recovered since last year, which is stable, but which is not progressing terribly. I sense they've been communicating over COVID virus management, but I don't expect improvements in the bilateral relationship in the near future. And without encouragement from the United States, strong encouragement from the United States, I don't see big prospects for improvement in the near term.
We have another question. There's been a lot of debate recently concerning Chinese behavior in connection to, greater assertiveness. I mentioned myself, and I do think that because China emerges rapidly from the pandemic, that while other countries, especially the United States, are still very much embroiled in it, not to mention other issues, of course, that we have, that as a consequence, some in China feel that they have more room to maneuver, more strategic space. So what about that? Is this is this for domestic purposes that China is being more assertive this way, or international? How much do you think Chinese foreign policy is going to change?
Well, of course, Taiwan, the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan, China's status as a claimant in the South China Sea are both strong domestic issues, as is Hong Kong. So whatever the mainland does politically vis-a-vis those three areas always has a strong domestic component. But it has international components as well. Chinese increased military operations in the vicinity of Taiwan this year are a matter of concern. They have clearly mounted some operations in response to US actions to which they object, including the February visit to the US of then Taiwan Vice President-elect William Lai. He had meetings in Washington with apparently pretty senior American officials. The Chinese objected to that vociferously and responded on the ground with increased air operations as well as maritime operations in the vicinity of Taiwan. Their operations and intimidation have increased in the South China Sea as well. And of course, Hong Kong, we're all pretty familiar with what's going on in Hong Kong right now. So all of those have strong domestic component, but the way in which China has articulated that domestic political pressure internationally suggests that the Chinese have less and less confidence in strong relations with the U.S.
Well, certainly these are questions that are going to be with us for some time. We also, of course, the political dimensions of evolving U.S.-China relations are another issue. And we have, Aniv, did you have something you'd like to add on the question of China right now?
Not on China specifically, but I would say that even amidst all of the aggression that we see in the South China Sea, or that we see with regard to the war of words between President Trump and President Xi, the relationship of, for example, Foreign Minister Motegi and Pompeo are still quite strong, and they're coordinating to both keep the seas very safe, but also to encourage the spread of PPE and also keep the communication in East Asia and in North America strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Certainly, there are many dimensions to U.S.-China relations exist in a bilateral context, but they also, of course, exist in broader regional perspectives, and U.S.-Japan relations are closely, if indirectly, related to those. We do have another question. What will U.S.-China relations be like after the election? If I might just add a word or two on that one, and then I'm sure Ambassador Shear and others may have some thoughts. The election certainly drives important aspects, together with the changing COVID dynamic, the changing relationships within Greater China, and so on. There are incentives, of course, to stress U.S.-China issues, short-term incentives in the election. Once the election is over, of course, there are some longer-term issues, such as the way that technology is developing, dual-use military-civilian technology, broad issues of geopolitical transition, third country relationships. But of course, the United States and China will have to deal with each other in the post-election context. And so there'll be a mixture of both the need for cooperation and then, of course, natural competitive dimensions that very well could be deepening. I don't know, Dave, do you want to add something to that?
Thanks, Ken. Well, of course, it'll depend on who wins the election. If President Trump wins the election, I'd expect that it will take some time for relations to cool off. Of course, if President Trump wins the election, he'll probably want to pivot from COVID to focusing on implementation of the Phase 1 trade agreement and negotiating a Phase 2 trade agreement. It's not clear that that either side can implement the Phase 1 trade agreement in a timely way, given the disruptions to the supply chain caused by the COVID virus. If the Democrats win, I don't expect that they will lift tariffs on Chinese goods quickly, but I would expect them to both continue bilateral trade talks with the Chinese, as well as more effectively enlisting our other like-minded trading partners in an approach to China. I doubt that the Democrats will loosen technology restrictions on China imposed by the Trump administration and by this Congress either. So it will take time for a Biden administration to strengthen our relationships with our allies, including our East Asian allies, and to engage those allies in a way that increases all of our leverage vis-a-vis China. And it will take time for the relationship with China to stabilize under the Democrats as well. So I wouldn't expect big changes, even if Biden wins, but you'll see changes in the level of rhetoric. You'll see probably a more multilateral approach on trade, and with continued restrictions on technology.
Now, we have a question actually related to that about Vietnam. How should we evaluate the Vietnamese government's response to COVID-19? Does it say that the Vietnamese government improved its openness or not? And what sort of role is the Vietnamese government providing to medical specialists? Is it politicizing COVID in the way that some countries do?
I think it's recognized globally that Vietnam's response to the COVID virus has been extremely effective. Vietnam's government, of course, is very authoritarian one that is not known for the transparency with which it handles its affairs, but at the same time, they have a reputation for having been quite transparent with the way in which they handled the virus. There is a large American CDC presence in Vietnam. They cooperate very closely with the Vietnamese, including having CDC people embedded in their Ministry of Health. I think that may be a model for American health cooperation, CDC cooperation with other countries. And the US Embassy in Hanoi is quite satisfied with the level of cooperation and the level of transparency achieved by the Vietnamese government in connection with the coronavirus crisis. They've increased their international prestige considerably as a result. They benefited in terms of the likely increased movement of supply chains to Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam is a primary candidate for movement of supply chains from China to elsewhere. And domestically, I think Prime Minister Phuc and Deputy Prime Minister Vu Duc Dam, who is placed in charge of managing the COVID crisis, have come out looking quite well.
Vivian Chen, I see that you have a question, an interesting question. I wonder, could you raise that? You want to come on and ask your question? It
Sure.
has to do with the future of Hong Kong and the democracy movement and various issues relating to Hong Kong.
Yes, so I wanted to ask both of you what you foresee the prospects of Hong Kong will be in the future in regards to the pro-democracy movement, potential expatriation of Hong Kongese to the UK, Taiwan, other countries. Boris Johnson also just stated that he'd be willing to admit almost 3 million Hong Kong people to the UK. So I was wondering what your thoughts about Hong Kong's future are.
Okay, maybe if I might just say a word, and then I'm sure Dave has a sophisticated response. I think we have to remember the infrastructure that Hong Kong has. Of course, it has tremendous web of relationships and business ties and a sophisticated financial market, one of the most important international markets, and deep and relationship with the dollar and so on. So a marginal, no doubt there will be costs. No doubt it will be more difficult for it to continue in its current role. No doubt or most probably there could be some movement to other financial centers like Singapore. But I think we certainly shouldn't forget the underlying strengths, as well as, of course, the deep interests of the people of Hong Kong and the value of Hong Kong itself to China. So I think, and actually, from what we can see so far of the response, it seems relatively after the national security law, apart from that issue, a more diffident response from Beijing, which may indicate an appreciation of the importance of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong itself is an important window between China and the world, and both the United States, the nations of the region, and China do have an interest in some sense, its preservation. But again, there's a delicate tension with the very important issues of human rights as well. Dave, what would you say to that?
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's clear that the people leading the demonstrations in Hong Kong are interested in continuing those demonstrations, and we've seen evidence of that already in response to the new Chinese law. On the Chinese side, I think the Chinese are going to be determined to stabilize the situation in Hong Kong. Whether or not that means they will introduce their own forces into the city is not clear. But Chinese in the National People's Congress's passage of the security law, the Chinese, largely for domestic political reasons, decided to drastically undermine Hong Kong's promised autonomy. Both the bilateral Sino-UK agreement on the reversion of Hong Kong in the 80s, as well as the Hong Kong Basic Law passed by the MPC, assure Taiwan of 50 years of a high degree of autonomy, and the Chinese have clearly undermined that, as they have undermined their one country, two systems principle. And I think that will have a knock-on effect on Taiwan as well. And I've seen reports in the press that Taiwan is expecting an influx of people from Hong Kong as well.
We have a question here about which suggests, this author I think is also suggesting or just wondering if there are things that could be done from China's side, obviously not revising the national or abrogating the recent legislation, but otherwise to provide more autonomy to Hong Kong and Taiwan that might moderate the situation, or have we simply crossed the Rubicon with the new national security legislation, just, creating gaps of trust or actual practical problems that really make it impossible to stabilize the current situation in Hong Kong.
Well, I don't think.
What about China? How about steps that China could take to moderate the situation?
Well, I don't think it's impossible to stabilize the situation. I think moderation on the Chinese side will be an important factor in that. And one thing the Chinese can do in the short to medium term is allow for free legislative council elections in the fall. I believe those elections are scheduled for September, and how the Chinese handle those elections will be an important indicator of how hard or how moderate they're going to be vis-a-vis Hong Kong. On Taiwan, it would certainly be, I think, in the interests of stability across the Taiwan Strait for mainland China to show more flexibility vis-a-vis Hong Kong. They've been relatively resigned to the presidency of Tsai Ing-wen, although a lot of senior Chinese officials appear to believe that she's a closet supporter of independence. They've been relatively restrained vis-a-vis Tsai herself, while putting a great deal of pressure on Taiwan's diplomatic relations with the countries that continue to recognize them. So I think with regard to Taiwan, China could show a lot more flexibility in its treatment of the one country, two systems model for Taiwan, as well as it could be more flexible with regard to its adherence to the so-called 92 consensus arrived at between a KMT government and its Chinese counterparts in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Monica. Monica, do you want to give us your question? It has to do with Korea, but maybe it's broader than that. What would your question be?
Sure. So I guess I was curious in how you think that export markets will be affected. Several states, including Korea, obviously have seen an uptick in exports and certain medical supplies, such as masks or testing kits. But it seems like there could be long-term trends in terms of isolation and a reversal of globalization on markets. So do you see that happening, or do you see more like regional consolidation or other things happening in the future long-term?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Let me take a stab at that. Clearly, one implication of this crisis is that it's more difficult to cross national boundaries, and there are problems, medical problems, first of all, with connectivity. National restrictions. It's very difficult to travel by air across the Pacific now. For example, Americans can't get into Japan or most of the countries, several of the countries in the region, and very long quarantines, of course, are also in effect. Now, a lot of those will begin to dissipate as the virus itself dissipates. But I think we could well be moving into an era in which broad-ranging globalization, trade in components, especially supply chains, which are global in character, especially if they involve China, are going to become more complex. No doubt, regionalization is going to be easier in travel, but also in product supply. Of course, there's a major cost factor that we have institutions and networks that have developed that make it easy to deal with the people that we've been dealing with. So my guess is that it would be difficult to move many supply chains rapidly out of China. But that said, probably more regionalization, shorter supply chains, some degree of, in the medical area, of course, that we're particularly concerned with reshoring, more insistence on domestic supply for national security reasons. But also another phenomenon we'll get is shifting away from China. Vietnam is one country where probably we will see greater sourcing from. Perhaps other parts of Southeast Asia in the higher end areas, Singapore, Korea, potentially Japan. So trade diversion together with the regionalization of supply chains. Dave, do you want to add to that?
No, I agree, Kent.
So that is really one important question. Another one that we have here has to do with the privacy implications of contact tracing apps used in Australia, Korea, Singapore, and so on. For example, in Singapore's Trace Together app, whereby you download this app, and then it will identify if you have somebody who's infected close by, or later, of course, if a person's becomes infected themselves, it helps in contact tracing. So the question is how those have both, what about the privacy implications of all of that, and also how they have impacted conversations on COVID response in the US more broadly. The point, I guess, what I could add is that, this comes to important questions of values. As Vivian was saying earlier in talking about contact tracing in China, some of the apps that are introduced there, which might be even more intrusive than those in Singapore and so on. For example, in Singapore's Trace Together, the government has information on contacts, but then there are software safeguards and so on that make it very difficult to broaden the use of that information. But there are, and this issue's come up in France and in Western Europe with some seriousness as to whether Singapore's app should be introduced in Europe. But then the issue about the United States contact tracing, the only thing that I could add is that Google and Apple apparently have also begun working on this issue as to whether it's technically possible to upgrade responses given using things like iPhones. I don't know if someone would like to add further on that point. Neve, I think you have something there?
Yes, so I have looked a little bit into the business cooperation on the side of US and Asia. And like you mentioned, Amazon and Facebook have also signed a pledge for open COVID technology sharing, but also Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Microsoft, and a few research labs have offered to share their information. And at the beginning of May rather, some Japanese companies also signed a similar pledge, such as Canon, Toyota, Nissan, and Yahoo Japan. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, not just for diplomatic cooperation, military cooperation, but also for business cooperation in this time of need.
Thank you, Neve. That was very useful. I thought I should probably add just one additional point on relating to the globalization issue that Monica and several others have raised. And that is that certainly we are getting some tendencies to regionalization, but we're also creating new regions. I guess I got interested in this in working and doing my supercontinent book. But I do believe that one consequence of the COVID-19 is to deepen relations across the Eurasian continent between China and particularly Central and Eastern Europe. As far as Britain in particular is concerned, of course, partly because of the Hong Kong issue, with Britain having been formerly the colonial power and being particularly disturbed by the erosion of one country, two systems, which was based on the basic law and agreements between Britain and China itself. So in the case of Britain, certainly the COVID crisis and the recent developments have complicated relationships there, which as recently as the foundation of the AAIB were, under David Cameron actually were relatively good. But if you look at Eastern Europe, if you look at Italy and Greece, the Mediterranean, China has provided quite a lot of assistance, and certainly in the case of Italy, which was one of the countries that was the worst hit. They provided large amounts of PPE to the Italians. And Italy is, together with Portugal, one of the few countries in Europe that have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. And so their relations do seem, even in spite of the fact that probably the COVID itself came into Italy from China, still the resentment of those early issues has been largely eroded and reduced by the assistance that China has given. And of course, there are politicians, some key strategically placed politicians in Italy who also are relatively close to China. So in Italy, in Serbia, in Greece, and several of the Central and Eastern European countries, actually, COVID has begun to create some, or deepen some new regional or trans-regional dynamics, even as it has eroded globalization. So at least those are some reactions. Do we have, I don't know, Dave, do you have any response on that or on some of the other issues that we've just touched on?
It was only a matter of time before the phrase health Silk Road popped up, and it has popped up.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Well, that is the line, of course, that China is pushing. This takes us to one issue of geopolitical importance that we haven't touched on that I think it's an interesting subject for speculation, and that is the vaccine. The major countries of the world seem to be in a race. Of course, it's a human security race, but also a race that has geopolitical implications to find a vaccine. China has China has moved to some human subjects testing. There are also, of course, cases in the United States, Moderna, among others, that have moved to testing, as well as to antibody testing in a variety of responses. So, of course, this is still in the future, but I wonder if some of our, what kind of a response ultimately we will be getting, or what kind of implications globally there will be once we get a vaccine. China has said that it's going to, open this to the third world and so on. What actually happens and how selectively something like that might proceed could be a question. But what about this question? What about the impact of, and also the procedures for the distribution of the vaccine as something that will affect Trans-Pacific relations and East Asia in the wake of COVID-19? I don't know. Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right, Kent. And the development of the vaccine is only the start of the complications. Of course, once the vaccine is developed, it will take time for whomever develops it to ramp up production. It will take time for them to manage the intellectual property implications of sharing the molecule with other pharmaceutical firms and other countries. It will take time. It will be difficult for the country that develops the vaccine to balance the need to use that vaccine domestically and to export that vaccine internationally. So these are all very complicated questions, and it's not clear to me the extent to which the United States, at least, has effectively grappled with them.
Yes, thank you. We have one brief question here. How will the COVID-19 shape domestic politics in China, specifically with regard to President Xi's leadership? And how likely is it to affect Chinese foreign policies? You want to take that?
I think we've already seen how it will affect Chinese foreign policy. The Chinese initially were very intent on ensuring that the story of the awkwardness with which they managed the crisis in the early stages was suppressed. And the story of the decisiveness with which President Xi addressed the crisis, he put himself at the center of that in early to mid-January. They wanted that story to get out in favor of the real story, at least at the beginning of the crisis. So that was the first Chinese effort. The second Chinese effort, of course, was their ramping up of COVID diplomacy. And you can see that particularly in the case of Southeast Asia and with the ASEAN countries. China and the ASEAN countries have conducted a variety of senior level meetings, including at the foreign minister level, to address the COVID situation. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has proposed that China and the ASEAN countries conduct a leaders level meeting on COVID. That has yet to take place, but I expect it will. And the ASEAN plus 3 countries, Japan, China, and the ROK, have also conducted several virtual meetings on COVID management. So in addition to all of the equipment that China has provided to Southeast Asia, their diplomacy has been very strong, including a visit to Myanmar by President Xi and a visit to China by Cambodia's leader Hun Sen.
Thank you very much. We're coming close to our appointed hour. Before we reach that, let me just mention, for those of you who have been interested in some of the key points that we made, we talk in our report, of course, about the medical supply issue in detail, about the implications for North-South relations, a lot of these China-related issues that we've just discussed. Our report is it's on the Reischauer Center website, which would be https at www.reischauercenter.org. We also will have elements of this on our Facebook page. And we expect that a version of this report will also be on YouTube. I wanted, in conclusion, to sincerely thank, of course, the senior fellow of the Reischauer Center and Ambassador David Shear, our Reischauer Policy Research Fellows that we're very proud of, Neve Denny, Monica Weller, Vivian Chen, Ayane Nakano, Sam Frost, and Evan Sankey, and all of you in this audience who have stuck with us. We are not, our COVID-19 task force is going to be continuing its activities. As we noted earlier, Japan is a big question mark in many ways. And so our next report is going to have to relate to Japan and COVID-19 as this issue moves forward. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thanks very much.